pretty clear in 2018 I was trying to understand and define the space around me. I read How Soccer Explains the World by Franklin Foer. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, and I wrote this about it in October of 2018. It's interesting that this book starts out mentioning that its soccer stories would progress from the more disheartening to the more redeeming over the course of its pages. That wasn't quite accurate for me. I was disheartened by most all of the detailed history reported by Foer throughout the book. It was only because, in my ignorance, I think I had a somewhat Pollyanna-ish idea about teams and their supporters. I wrongly imagined soccer and all games to be a respite from politics and religion. I'd hoped that in some sort of Olympic spirit, sport and soccer in particular could be a place where we as people could express our tribalism in a less violent and vehement way. I knew about the stories of hooliganism and even deaths resulting from soccer violence, but I hadn't deeply conceptualized those incidents and their origins until reading the great global descriptions in this book. I used to think they were anomalies. I wanted to think they were anomalies. This book has helped me to see more clearly about all human nature and how deep our divisions persist and how it comes out in quite literally everything we do. I thought that I wanted to read this alongside the recent Russian World Cup, but I didn't get to it yet at that point. It turns out that right now is more appropriate anyway. Right now, when I'm fretting over the tribalism that is deeply dividing the US in a way not unlike the warring supporter factions described in the different chapters here. I'm not exactly sure what the right takeaway is for me on this one, but because of Foer's deep knowledge and embedded experiences, he's given me a dose of reality that's super important at this place and time. Before I read this, I was shocked that politics, religion, economic philosophy, and really all of society had become a flag-waving rivalry. Foer helped me understand that it's always been this way, and my desire to reject the games that people play over power and winning in society is going to be much more difficult and revolutionary than I ever could have imagined. This is really interesting in going through this project because I was reading these books during the first Trump administration. We talked about before about Rise to Greatness, about the most difficult year under Lincoln in the Civil War, and how that helped me understand how deep the sort of divisions were in American politics and how it was common and it wasn't a new experience. This book is kind of similar in that way. I describe in the review here about how I had this sort of Pollyanna-ish view about the way things were in the world. I don't know if that's just me, I call it out as ignorance in the review, but I think it's me kind of being in a realm of wishful thinking about the world. I think I want those things to be places where we can compete and we can have those rivalries without it being so intensely difficult for us to get through. And these games that I might have been hoping were separate from those things are actually more kind of indicative of those things. They're kind of windows into those conflicts that already exist. It's really interesting to consider these now, reminding me, especially now that we're in the second Trump administration, there still is this sort of deep divide with us as a people in the US. It's neat that I read these books as kind of a way to deal with my disenchantment or my confusion at the way things were going, and that reading the history and reading about some other examples of conflict helped me to deal with those situations when I was experiencing them for the first time in those years. And it's really interesting now that as I'm going through on this YouTube channel and talking about the reviews and talking about what I learned from these books, to revisit that they were a lesson in that for me then, because it seems like I'm calling it out as ignorance here, but it's almost like we get acclimated to the outrage to some degree that we forget as people that it's kind of an ongoing thing. It's a pattern. The fight is a pattern. The conflict is a pattern, and we keep living it. And there's ways for us to get better. If Foer describes it as starting disheartening and moving towards something that's more redeeming, that ideally that's where we would be going with our conflicts in everything in the world, that it is hard, and it might be really hard now, but as we keep working on things, that we can move to something that's more redeeming and less violent and less filled with conflict. I guess now I'm starting to sound like wishful thinking again, but it's helpful for me in the pattern of reading these things in the late 20-teens to now go back and remember the things that I learned there and remember that it's okay. One of the things that's interesting here that I talk about when I talk about my lessons is this concept of the games that people play over power and winning. I think for myself, I've gone through a lot of evolutions in looking at that and thinking about the right way to be. If we take the lessons of what happens on the political stage or what happens in the world, and especially today in 2025, we can come to a lot of interesting conclusions about those things, those games that people play over power and winning. This sort of polarization that puts two dynamically different ideas of what is positive or what is good for us as individuals and us as a group of people is something that's really hard to reconcile. Instead of fretting over the distance between those 2 points, there is some reassurance in reading about these ongoing conflicts, be them political, be them in terms of sports, or be them in terms of the things that we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. There's some reassurance that if we are following our beliefs, that it will lead to the kind of positive world that we want if we just stay focused on that. There's a through line for that for me through a lot of these books, both in terms of the nonfiction ones and the fiction ones, to trust ourselves and to trust what we believe is the right thing. We can all do this. We're living this pattern over and over again until we get it right for ourselves. This one was another one of those books that I think I sought out with the idea that it would help me understand something that I love. I'm a massive soccer fan too. I've been a soccer player my whole life. And so I loved hearing those stories about soccer, but using something that was a love of mine and something that I cared about a lot to help me understand the world. Because this title calls it out right there. I don't know if it actually did explain it to me, but I gave it 4 out of 5 stars because it distilled some interesting concepts into simple ways for me to understand through a sport that I love. How Soccer Explains the World by Franklin Foer. I read it in 2018. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Till next.